My name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Joel Gunderson. We're at Cooper's Hall in Portland. It's June 23rd, 2020. Joel, thanks so much for joining us today. First question, why wine?
That's a big question.
It is a big question.
Wow. Well, professionally speaking, I guess I had a daughter. I was a broke poet in my 20s, and I had a best friend, Chef Aaron Barnett with Restaurant St. Jack, who was goading me into exploring wine as a professional career, mainly so that we could open a restaurant together. And so I would say, why wine? Two reasons. One, I had a good friend who believed in me more than I believed in myself. And I had a daughter, and I didn't get into the graduate programs for poetry that I was hoping to, and so wine. Wine is a safety, right? But I mean, obviously, restaurants, wine, food, it all falls into a particular romantic vision of life. And I would say that I'm a pretty big sucker for a romantic vision of life, and I try to live my life within a romantic vision, I guess. As in, how can you live your life to the full extent of your own imagination, and push forward with imaginative force, and wine really was a great avenue for that.
So tell me about, you kind of brought up a little bit, tell me about pre-wine life. You had visions of being a poet.
Yeah, I mean, that never goes away, right? That's those delusions. But yeah, so my parents were missionaries. I grew up in the Philippines. Before that, in the 80s, my dad had bought a tent and he did evangelistic crusades throughout the United States. Prior to that, we were in Afghanistan when the Russians invaded. And so we were in Kabul when they dropped bombs on Kabul. And so I came back to the US with dreams of being a poet, went to college, was a broke artist, fell in love, moved to Portland, eventually married that girl, still married to her with 3 children. Yeah, so I spent most of my 20s slinging Reubens at Kornblatt's Deli and writing poetry, and then when I had a daughter, it was go time, and ended up working 3 jobs, went through the ISG, International Sommeliers Guild program to get credentials. Of course, I think they went out of business, so yay. Money well spent. But no, I mean, so yeah, it was really kind of that relationship with Aaron that pushed me towards thinking about my love of food and love of wine more seriously. And
so tell me about Restaurant St. Jack and about getting into that part of food and wine, and at what point were you intrigued enough by wine to go down that path, to go to the ISG, to take those steps you needed to become a som?
Right. I talked Aaron into moving to Portland. I would say Restaurant St. Jack was a 6-year conversation that involved a lot of drinks. And so we would drink, we'd hang out. He would, he did his externship at Lumiere up in Vancouver, and then went down to Gary Danko's in San Francisco, and then helped open a restaurant in Palm Springs. And so I would go visit him in these different places. We would drink a lot. We would talk about how we needed to open a restaurant together someday. And I talked him into moving into Portland. He talked me into becoming more serious about dining and food, and I staged at his space in his kitchen down in Palm Springs, and also here in Portland. But then he hired me on for a server and then front of the house manager and at the different locations that he worked at. And then he got fired from 23 Hoyt during the last downturn, actually, because they wanted 23 Hoyt to be an upscale restaurant, a fine dining restaurant. Then, of course, the downturn happened and the recession, and so they let him go and reconcepted that establishment to more of a casual bar or an upscale bar sort of situation. And then, that next year we were just planning restaurant, actually I guess a year and a half, planning Restaurant St. Jack. I worked at New Seasons Market. I got out of restaurant for a minute, worked New Seasons as a wine steward. And then we kept dreaming and asking people to put money into our dream. And I found an investor. He found Kurt Huffman with Chef's Table, and he partnered with Kurt, hired me on, and then we found the location. The original location was on Southeast 21st in Clinton, and the landlord was a contractor. He failed. So the last month before we were open, my first day of work was December 1st. Walked into a space that was in complete shambles, and basically Kurt, Aaron, the sous chef at the time, Graham Cheney, and one of our line cooks, we finished the build out together, and all of us lost about 20 pounds because we literally had no money, so we all pretended to each other like we might have money and could go out and grab a bite to eat for lunch, but none of us could. So we were just working these like 12 to 16-hour days and going home and wolfing some food and having a drink and passing out. But that was kind of the behind the scenes of the hope in a prayer that was Restaurant St. Jack. We often joked later that the build out for one of the bathrooms at Ava Jean's cost more than our entire opening budget at Restaurant St. Jack. Yeah. Which actually I think cost comparison is true. But.
So once it opened, and prior to, what was the dream? What was it you were trying to achieve, and did it come to fruition?
Yeah. So I mean, in the years of discussion, Aaron had gotten more into the sort of gastro pub idea. And when I was studying to become a somm, I started studying the sort of Lyonnaise bouchons. And I was like, oh, Aaron, I'm studying these bouchons. This actually seems like what you're talking about, but like a little truer to the source. And sort of like in this, I guess, postmodernist idea of resurrecting or things that, there were a lot of people doing, or not a lot, but there were people doing their takes on French food as opposed to trying to find these sort of like classic dishes and translating them over into the American palate a little bit, without as much sort of a personal stamp on it, I guess. A classic example of that from St. Jack would be the Pia De Cochon Dish, which is it's a pork shank, or just the trotter basically, and the shank would be there. But we pulled out the shank. We would confit that, make a shank confit dish, and then we would take the skin from that shank region and the trotter too, and we would cure it for a couple of days in a salt brine, and then we would wrap veal, use it as a sort of basically a casing for veal sweetbread, and bind it with chicken mousseline, throw some cremini mushrooms in there, let that set for 2 days. And then in the original recipe, or the original vision of that dish, you would just roast it off. So what Aaron did, he would just roll it in breadcrumbs to give it a bit of a crunch. And so it held the essence of the dish, but it provided a little bit of a crunch just so the dish wouldn't get lost in translation, and it wouldn't be this like lovely French gelatinous mess that maybe sounds good in a novel, but not great on your plate. So, I mean, I like that kind of stuff, but not everybody does, and that just like little tweaks like that. So, and so a lot of that just came out of conversations that we had through the years. Interestingly enough, so we're here at Cooper's Hall. This is a keg-focused winery. The whole keg focus for me started when we opened Restaurant St. Jack in 2010, and it came about because Kurt Huffman lived in Lyon and actually helped open a brewery in Lyon. And he said, well, you know what we did? We went to Beaujolais and we just sourced wine and we'd bring it back in bag and box and then retrofit it into a cask. So it looked like we were pouring out of cask. And so I started talking to people, and I think it was in a conversation with Patrick Taylor, and he's like, yeah, I don't want to do that. He's like, but have you ever considered maybe kegs? I hear people are doing that. So I think Irving Street Kitchen was doing it at the time. I reached out to the wine buyer for Irving Street Kitchen, and they were co-owned by a place down in San Francisco. Talked to her, she gave me her insight. We planned our sort of program off of that, but we didn't have any money, and so I started calling around asking how much kegs cost, and like new kegs were $95 for an empty shell, and it was right at that time that they were converting from the squat pony kegs to the slimmer 6-barrel and slimmer quarter barrel. And so there was kind of like a dearth there was no kegs available, and if I could get them, they cost more than the budget because I needed 25 kegs to open the wine program, and we didn't have $2,500 extra dollars for kegs. So I was on the internet looking up kegs, and there was a place called Kegs to Go. And I called them and I said, hey, you know, would you sell me empty keg shells? And they're like, yeah, sure, we'll do that. I'm like, well, how much? And they're like, well, $25. I'm like, I can do that, I can afford that. I'm like, well, how many do you have? And they're like, well, we have like 5. So I went down to Kegs to Go. It was way out on 122nd and Division, and it turned out to actually be a strip club called the Double Dribble, and it was like the dirtiest, most seedy strip club in the world. I had actually never been in a strip club before, but there I was at 10 in the morning in a strip club buying kegs that was totally illegal. They were selling me Budweiser kegs, and it wasn't theirs to sell. And so for like the next 2 months, I was buying kegs that kind of fell off the truck from the Double Dribble. And basically the wine program at St. Jack and every keg wine program for Olive Chef's Stable is built off of me going to the Double Dribble and buying totally stolen kegs. Yeah.
That's incredible. That's incredible.
That's what St. Jack was built on too, just stories like that. And so I think our dreams did come true. It was hard, you know, it was a hard 3 years. It's hard being the GM of a restaurant that is your best friend's dream and vision as well, and being running the books, running the sanity of the space, and being the emotional support of your best pal too. And so, but after 2.5 years, Kurt asked if I would partner with him on this project, which at the time was being called Bulkhead, and it was going to be a keg project. And so of course I was the keg guy by then. By then I had helped open Oven and Shaker and helped consult on a number of the other Chef's Table restaurants. And I said, yeah, I would love to be a part of that project. We just have to change the name. And so I was the last person to become a partner here at Cooper's Hall, and I was the one that made everybody change the name. Yeah. I just didn't like the idea of like Bulkhead being bulk, anything be associated with the wine that we were going to do. And so it's like I knew that we were going to be in this large format thing. I had spent 3 years of dealing with keg wine and kind of dealing with the pushback from the wine community, the sort of snootiness around wine culture, the sort of all the sort of bullshit trappings that happen with wine. But I just, to me, bulk signifies low quality. And my vision for keg wine with St. Jack and with every location was always talking people into putting wine that most people would think has no business being in keg and keg, you know. So 2 years ago, I think, 3 years ago maybe now, one of my dreams came true with talking Doug Tennell into putting his Gamay into keg. This year, John Paul finally put his Clos Electric Blanc into keg. And so, you know, there's going from the strip club to Clos Electric Blanc. It's been a good 10-year journey.
I'm curious about, before we get more into kind of Hall and sort of post St. Jack.
Yeah, sure.
I'm curious about the education part of it for you, and what about wine kind of intrigued you, and what it was you were, what it kind of fulfilled for you. What about wine education and about building programs like this? What was the fulfilling part for you? What excited you about it?
Right. As far as like the sort of ISG program that I went through, it was a good program in that it was more academically focused. It wasn't like tableside focused, and so actually just getting that foundation of really boring information that you can lean on and, you know, memorize, kind of put as part of like something you can take for granted, I guess. You know, I think when I went to college, they told me that education is a luxury, and I do see even the wine education as that sort of luxurious aspect, in that like I can talk smack about Court of Masters or any sort of wine program that builds a particular lexicon around wine, but the only reason I can do that is because I actually did receive an education. And so, in a sense, it is that education that kind of gives me the power to have sort of this base level information that I can use as warfare later on. So, sorry. So, I mean, that was a painful process for me during that time, because I was working 3 jobs. It was the recession. I did have a newborn baby, and I was going to class 9 hours every Sunday, so working 6 days a week, and kind of relinquishing a dream of going to school for writing, and trying to figure out, you know, hearing people say, well, wine is poetic, wine is art, and I was like, is it though? Like, is it? Like, poetry is art. Like, poetry is amazing. I don't know if wine can do that. And so I think in that moment there was definitely sort of this existential crisis that I was going through. Kind of, I mean, how hilarious is that? Like, giving up one completely unnecessary thing for another completely unnecessary thing. You know, it's like, well, that's pretty funny. And so Yeah, and I think, like in that time, writers like Andrew Jeffords, who I think he writes with Saveur now, but he wrote The New France way back in the day, finding these writers who were writing about wine, not just in a sort of really awful, painful way, but really giving life to it, was really important. And then with Restaurant St. Jack, trying to build, I think this was in 2010, so like trying to build a more Vin de Paix narrative, trying to say like, hey, there's these regions that are overlooked, and let's start thinking about them. And while that is complete accepted knowledge now, that was not accepted knowledge back in 2010. I think the last decade has just moved wine into and broken down so many barriers within how we think about wine. But I felt like, as far as the education was concerned, you're always looking for benchmarks. You're always looking for like, well, this is how it should be, and here's the typical. And obviously, the fun thing about getting into a program originally that leaned on sort of the Vin de Paix, leaned on Beaujolais. I remember when we did our first Oregon Nouveau festival at St. Jack with Scott Frank with Bow and Arrow and Tom Monroe with Division. I think it was 2011 or 2012, and people were just like, what the hell are you guys doing? Like, Nouveau? That's stupid. And I was like, I think that was the first year that Foillard made a Nouveau too, and so I actually had some of that, and I was pouring Foillard Nouveau for people, and it was just like, people from the wine community who showed up for the event were just like, kind of laughing about the fact that we were doing Nouveau, and I was like, well, here, drink this, and it was a beautiful young Côte de Pie, and it's like, oh, well, that is actually quite good, and so I think, again, though, I think having the education allowed me to then begin to have fun and then begin to push the boundaries. When I was in college, I remember when my professor we learn the structure of the English language so that we know how to break the rules. And I would say that I think that's probably that's what I like to tell my teams, when I'm doing staff education for wine programs. It's like, we can have this basic information, so we don't look like an asshole tableside and make a fool of ourselves, because that sucks. And there's always going to be some jerk at a table that's going to try to make you feel bad. And so we want to protect ourselves from that jerk. And then second, so that we can have fun, and we know how to break the rules. We know how to buy. For people in the hospitality industry, it's like, look, this is a part-time gig for you probably for 5 years, and you're going to go on for the rest of your life. But if you know how to buy wine really well for the rest of your life, that's a great thing that I can give to you right now. And so it's just, sorry, I'm rambling, but.
It's a great answer.
Yeah.
So I'm curious then, was it almost immediate in terms of formal education and then immediately deconstructing your formal education? Was that part of your initial process, or was that a philosophy that evolved as you evolved?
No, I mean, like in the formal education, like I think finding people like Foillard, finding people like Mas de Damascasac, and then back in 2010, Mas de Damascasac was like not old and stodgy. It was still, right? It was still like, wow, that's pretty neat, and they're breaking the rules, and just the conversation between Vin de Paix and AOC, and is it more important to celebrate tradition of a region or break the rules of a region, and getting into sort of some of the more social questions of wine started to intrigue me right away. Like with Beaujolais, like here is a wine that has been a peasant's wine. But when the aristocracy needed it, they utilized it. And then they threw it away again when they didn't need it anymore for more aristocratic wine. So conversations like that really began to intrigue me, and to be able to utilize wine to think about social structures, think about our view of wine, what's reinforcing sort of social bias. Why is an aged wine better than a young wine? Why do we put weight and money on that? So those things really started to intrigue me pretty quickly, and obviously if you go down that rabbit hole, well, because the people who can afford them also have to afford the capital to store them. And so if we're thinking back through the history of wine, here's the peasants who don't, here's the aristocracy who did, and of course the taste of the aristocracy is always the most important. And so, so I think pretty quickly I started thinking about those things. And obviously I didn't have these kinds of full thoughts about them then, but I was intrigued. I told my teacher with ISG when I finished, I said, I now have a nice sophomoric understanding of wine, and I'm looking forward to the next 10 years to actually learn what the hell I'm talking about. And so I would say 13 years after that, I feel like I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. Obviously, being in a wine project with Evan Martin with Sadness and Gamay and Sadness and Chardonnay humbles me. I go out there and he tells me about what we're doing with the wine, and I just feel like an idiot. And our winemaker partner here, Phil Kramer with Alex Ellie Vineyard, I go out and work with him, and he tells me about soil structures and what actually happens with the plants, and I feel like an idiot. And so, so 13 years later, sophomoric still,
Tell me about how that process then translates into actually building a wine list or building a wine program. What were you looking for in wines for the restaurant in St. Jack? And then as you went forward, how did you kind of negotiate what should be maybe on a wine list versus what you wanted to have on a wine list versus what the jerk at the table would expect to be on a wine list?
Yeah. And not to denigrate guests or anything.
No, I understand.
There are just a few of them out there. Well, the original vision of St. Jack was to build a Lyonnaise Bouchon that was down and dirty and full of soul. So from the onset, it gave me the opportunity to build a soulful wine list that was filled with self-expression. So originally, and when I was the Somm general manager who was on the floor 6 nights a week, that wine list, I was able to build it as a personal expression, and I learned a lot through it. And so I'd say building that wine list was an education in itself. I also had to abandon price points that I hoped that we could sell wine at, and understand that markups are for real and they're there for a reason. Otherwise, my friend doesn't get paid because he's the chef owner and he's the last person to get paid in the building. And so building that balance of a cool wine list and making sure that your margins are in check was a very personal thing for me, because I knew my buddy's mortgage was on the line, and that was a good trial by fire situation. But getting into hospitality, the hospitality of St. Jack too. The funniest thing was that it was a French restaurant, and my wine list was too cheap. And I had people coming in and they wanted baller wines. They wanted, they wanted Cocherie. They wanted these things, and so they wanted Rouleau. So hunting down kind of glass pouring Tempier so I could get a Rouleau allocation. Things like that started happening, and so kind of that, I wasn't expecting that, and starting to chase down Chateau Palmers and things like that for your Bordeaux drinkers. But then also making sure that that yellowtail profile was on the list too. I mean, low acid, high fruit. So I had a guest come in, and when I went tableside, they let me know that they didn't like Italian wine because it was too high in acid and you need food with it. And I said, well, thankfully you're in a French restaurant. But French wine also tends to be high in acid, so thank goodness you're about to eat dinner. Which is a really shitty thing to say to a guest. But I actually didn't. I steered them towards the Côte d'Aron, and we found something. But I was like, actually, I need something just like a little juicier, a little less expressive, I guess. Or I'm not going to say what region I sourced that wine from, but it was on this side of the pond for sure. Yeah, I think those are the things that you can't be taught, and that comes from being engaged with guests and going tableside, and maybe getting your ass handed to you once or twice by like a Josh Bergstrom who comes in and wants to just drink well, and you not having anything for them, and but them still being very gracious about it. And I think those are the ones where you're like, well, that person was super sweet. They weren't a jerk at all, but I really didn't have what they were hoping for in this experience. And so that's really what shifted my mentality towards wine list building towards an extension of hospitality. And so and hospitality does have personal expression. The hospitality does not mean that we're some sort of automaton that panders to every wish of the guest. That's not what hospitality is. Like, hospitality is always set by a particular set of cultural signifiers inside a particular space, and adhering to them, and giving graciously out of yourself within that. I would say some of the greatest hospitality that I've received in my life was in barrios in the Philippines. Or, my mom was a missionary, and she works with Filipino midwives and delivers babies for the women in the barrios around where we lived. And being on a jeepney, which is a public transit there in the Philippines, and sending money up to pay the jeepney driver, and having him send the money back and say, no, not Nigeria. Your money's no good here. And so understanding that, when we talk about hospitality, a lot of times people say like, well, what's hospitality? And people would be like, attention to detail, or knowing your stuff. It's like, in some ways it's giving from the heart. And so, obviously within restaurants, it's a combination of many of those things. But attention to detail, knowing your stuff without anything heartfelt, I think is garbage. And it's fine, but it's not what I want to do. Or if more people put that little extra heartfelt thing into it, or the desire to be vulnerable into their lists, I think it'd be important. That said, curating lists for different places, like Oven and Shaker, understanding where the space is. I would say that was another learning curve when I opened Oven and Shaker, because Kathy Wims and I concepted the list, but it was an East Side list and not a downtown Portland list, and really it took years to kind of modify and understand, hey, there's no reason not to give people known wines, Chianti, Barbera d'Alba, but still celebrate really special stories from special producers. So it was a way of kind of shifting, again, my thought structure and saying like, hey, like let's provide comfort for people, familiarity for people, but still push a particular agenda of quality wine and producers who are practicing organic or biodynamic, or and then having some room for exploration as well. So like, where St. Jack was a list that was 95% personal and exploration, Oven and Shaker became 95% familiar with 5% exploration, so that there was just like a little bit of a fun thing, or like a fun little like coast wine on the list that was super cheap, and so any wine nerd would be like, oh wow, that at that price, like, well done, rewarding people for knowing their stuff. And then, just odd experiences, like I helped open a restaurant in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, learning how to navigate Wyoming liquor laws from few states away, and pouring through all of the importers' FOB lists, translating FOB to landed costs, understanding shipping times, all remotely, and then going out for like 4 days to do 6-hour trainings with people that would rather be skiing, but really sweethearted kids. That was cool. And then turning right around and opening Omerta, which was a full-on vanity project from Gordon Sondland, our dear friend, Gordon Sondland. And suddenly having like a $75,000 budget to put a list together, and hunting down things, and interestingly enough, it was the Jackson Hole space that was weird and wonky, and being able to pour through what importers actually have as opposed to what was available on our market, that I was able to pull together that list and bring things onto market that didn't exist in Portland. So to have a restaurant that had wines that no one else had, it all came out of years of relationships with people, and then also actually pouring over wholesale catalogs, and all that stuff is important. Like when I get away from seeing what's current seeing what the price points are, which is easy to do in a program like this, because I'm just working directly with a lot of winemakers, then I have to let go and re-educate myself for that too. So there's like that primary education, but there's a constant education of what's happening on the market, who's currently stocking what, how are you going to navigate price points. Are you going to work with certain distributors based on philosophical differences? Are you going to suck it up and play with the devil here and there in order to get what you need over here, or to support one little person that's in that brand? So I think a decade after St. Jack opening, it's a constant education, as far as each year presents a different sort of new dilemma and new learning curve.
I'm curious about your definition of hospitality is intriguing to me, and I'm curious about when it comes to you talk about the kind of established, you have an established set of rules, established set of for social engagement. How far do you compromise? Do you bend out of what especially thinking about, like, you talk about your downtown location, your downtown restaurant, and having to like reshape that list.
Okay.
How far do you bend to a customer expectation versus this is the vision we have for this place and take it or leave it? How do you walk that line?
Yeah, I think that's going to change dramatically in the next few months, actually. I remember one time at 23 Hoyt, this is obviously 13 years ago, I had a charming gentleman who was just appalled that we didn't have Heineken. And I went back to Chef Aaron and I said, hey, I want to run up the street to Plaid Pantry and buy this guy a Heineken. And so I did. I went and bought a 6-pack of Heinekens, and I said, you know what, we don't have it, but I went up the street and I cracked open a Heineken for you. So I think that hospitality does exist within a particular cultural framework. Again, you can be in a diner and have great hospitality. It's just, it's just very salt of the earth service, and it's very different, and the expectations around it might be a little bit different. That story I told of not having that sort of yellowtail structured wine on my list, I actually tell it during staff training, because I actually look at it as a failure of hospitality, in that I was too obsessed with my own vision of what wine should be, and didn't have something that a person could go to. And again, I with Oven and Shaker in that list, it was conforming. It was finding that happy meeting place between being able to make somebody feel safe and secure inside your space. Like, people don't like feeling like idiots. They don't like going places to feel dumb. And so, and people can be nervous. If you go into a space, we as the servers, as the somms, we're comfortable in our space, but somebody might not be, and I would say, well, it all exists within a particular cultural sphere. It's still important to understand some basic elements of human kindness, and again, thinking of it as like your own home, and when we opened Cooper's Hall, the Friends and Family Night, I said, everybody that's coming into the space for Friends and Family Night, they're all friends and family of all of the partners, which means it's like your pain in the ass aunt who's coming to Thanksgiving. And yes, I know that they all suck, but they are our friends and they are our family. So like, let's just treat it that way. And so I guess my vision is a little messier than the sort of tidy Danny Meyer vision of it, but hopefully it provides experiences that are a little bit more authentic and can help shape my team a little bit beyond these walls to think conscientiously about the people that they're taking care of. And then, of course, to know that they come to me and speak frankly about what's happening inside our space as well. So, and again, going back to wine lists, I do love wine lists that are obviously cocky as hell and built to show off the intelligence of the buyer. They're fun. They're fun for me. I don't. It's a lot more fun if you have a list like that and then have a buyer that shows up tableside and is actually sweet and pleasant and kind of has that kind of counterbalance to the sort of like erudite aspect of a particular list. But when I was in Barcelona last year too, going to all of the natural wine bars, I was like, oh hell, these people are actually having fun. And so I think that's another aspect of hospitality, is having fun and letting people have fun and having fun with wine and building a list that could be fun and might have joy and expression, and being okay when your guest doesn't know their stuff, I keep bringing up Yellowtail because my teacher 12 years ago said, we need to talk about Yellowtail, we need to understand Yellowtail, we need to understand why it's the most popular wine in the world, what's its flavor profile, and if somebody says they love Yellowtail Shiraz, then we know where they're at, and then we can move forward from there. And we never denigrate somebody's taste. We never, and I know that's tough. I was a poet who became a sommelier, so like I'm as arrogant as the next person. So it can be difficult, but again, that is hospitality. It's overcoming your self-importance too, and doing, like on a busy night of service, sometimes you don't have it left in you, and you're getting crushed, and your kitchen's in the weeds, and you have to go up to a table, and you might not really have much left to offer them, and maybe their meal's 30 minutes behind, and it's coming up to that table with some dignity and showing them respect, and so I really feel like wine lists should carry some of that load too, and how we approach the guest interaction with wine and wine lists should have some of that.
What do you consider your role in terms of guest education? If someone doesn't know much about wine, do you consider your role to be an educator, or do you consider your role to be finding them something that they will like within their kind of already known wine world?
So that's a level of trust, right? So I think gaining that trust first is important, and trying to find something within their comfort level so that you can gain that trust. You can see, most of the wines that I served through the last 10 years, for St. Jack, for instance, everything there was maybe a touch outside of people's comfort level, or I would just say Beaujolais, of course. What you Beaujolais? You're in Lyonnaise Bouchon, drink Beaujolais, and getting people excited about that. That was a cheater's move, but it generally worked. But nudging people forward, I would say, like that. If it's a one and done guest experience and they're only in for one visit, but you see if faces come back, and then you get to build those relationships. I think also, my year and a half on the retail side of things was really informative to that, because you did have people coming back every other day or once a week, and you'd put a bottle in their hand and they'd say, oh, I didn't like it. Oh, I loved it. And, oh, what did you like about it? And start having those conversations with people. So education, yes, but education within a conversation and within a relationship. And if you can't, lord something over a person, and sometimes it's tricky. Sometimes you're like, I thought I had this person's number, and I presented a wine to them and they hated it. It's like that. And there's no conceivable reason why they should not, everything that you've served them before and lines up with that profile, and so it's also understanding that sometimes it's just fickle. Sometimes people's tastes are just like 1 + 1 does not equal 2 as far as people's taste profiles are concerned, and so just being able to take that step back and go from there. I buy wines for some of our investors too, and that can be tricky, because you're putting together like a $7,000 order that's going to go in someone's cellar, and then having people be like, oh, we trust you, Joel, and then you're like, great, and then you get pictures. They'll send you pictures from where they're drinking it, and most of it is like, this is awesome, and then every once in a while it's like, whoa, this is terrible, and you're like, thank goodness I only gave them 3 of those, and then again, education comes from relationship, and some of that trust is also based on the amount of hospitality that you're giving to people. So if they feel safe and secure inside your space, if they feel like they aren't being talked down to, if they feel like they're being lifted up, if they feel like they're being celebrated, then you have a lot more opportunity to then invite them into a larger conversation about wine. And so, a lot of times here, I'll just be up at the bar and we have all the wines on tap, and so I'll be chit-chatting with somebody, ask them what they're drinking, and I mean, I do have the luxury. I'm the owner, one of the partners, and so I'll just throw a few things in front of them and let them, and then chit-chat about the producers, and we work with over 100 local producers, so, and I know them all, so I can tell them something about them and tell them some of the stories, and that's that's the big thing too. I think, say even with the natural wine movement, framing what you're about to present inside of a story so that they understand what they're about to receive. And so I guess that would be part of the education. It's like saying, if somebody, say at St. Jack, orders a wine that has some age on it, don't let them know that a wine that has age is going to taste like this as if they don't know it, but just start talking about the wine itself and about how excited you are about where it's at in its maturing process and how it's getting more savory, and seeing some of those tertiary notes are coming out, so that sure, you're educating them, maybe because maybe they don't drink a lot of wine that has age, and then they can then make that decision again, like, oh well, actually I was looking for something a little bit more fruit forward, and I just wanted to spend $400. Well, we can do that.
Do you find when you're talking about wine with people that they respond more to you talking about the wine itself and its notes, or about the people behind the wine, the stories behind the wine?
I mean, it's good to sprinkle in some wine notes, but tasting notes suck. Come on. So boring. So it's how do you get those into the conversation without obsessing about it, not pulling that, I have the Somm palette and here's my thesaurus of wine descriptions. Nobody needs that in their lives, right? And then also just simple things this wine has a ton of energy, or people would rather drink a wine that you say is kick-ass than something that has a huge laundry list of. So if you're this wine is kick-ass, the person who makes it is really cool, really sweet-hearted, that cares a lot about the environment, or different things like that. I think people like that whole situation, and it sets it up. Again, it tees off the wine itself, so that they aren't penciling down your tasting notes, and then they're tasting it and be like, oh yeah, I do see that, or I don't see that. It's not a comparison of who can taste the wine better. It's let's celebrate kind of where this wine has come from, the energy that it has, what it's giving to us here today, as opposed to just descriptions. Yeah.
I don't actually taste the shoe leather in this wine.
Yeah. Well, you should. There are forest fires all around it, and so there's a lot of shoe leather on that wine. Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier you were invited into the Cooper's Hall. So tell me about what the vision for this place was, and what your role was as you were brought on board.
Yeah, so I was brought on to be the front of the house manager, so for the restaurant aspect of it, and then to curate, to build and create an extended guest tap list. So we have 22 guest wines at all times. So, that was my primary role. Of course, when we opened this space, right away people were like, I want to have a party here, I want to have a wedding here. And so our events program kind of became our bread and butter here. One of the partners was our wholesale manager, and he went on to to open a different project, and so I took over wholesale as well, took over everything. So I'm the operating partner now. So it went from me kind of having a specific restaurant-focused aspect to kind of coordinating with our winemaker, our ops manager here, who is our assistant winemaker, Adam Rack, to our one person on the wholesale team, doing all that, keeping track of all of the events and being in touch with my event director and making sure everything's going there, and then regular tap room. So, you know, that was pre-COVID, but we'll see how things move forward post-COVID.
Before COVID, which we'll talk about in a second here, what was it that was different, is different about Cooper's Hall? What attracted people? What besides is an immense space, what was special and unique about it?
Yeah. I mean, I'd say the building itself is so cool. This is prefabbed in Detroit back in 1952 for the auto industry, and this was an auto shop for Ron Tonkin Auto way back in the day. So I think the building itself has a lot of creative energy inside of it. It's actually one of the reasons why I wanted to be involved, just so I could be in the space every day. I think spaces are important, give a particular energy. I would say though, just again, right when we opened, somebody asked me if like the wine program here would appeal to onophiles, and I said I could care less. I actually just want people who actually enjoy themselves to come into my space. So I think, again, my attitude towards wine is hopefully joyfulness and approachability. You can order any of the wines by the number, so people don't have to stumble over names that they can't pronounce, like a Gewürztraminer or you know, even Marsanne or Roussanne or things like that, or Mourvèdre, you know, like they could just default to the number. And so we did and do see a lot of people just ordering flights by number. We have 2-ounce pours in here too, because we can do everything small scale because it's all on tap. Yeah, and then it just feels like a party. And so instead of having, you know, generally having like Wu-Tang or Outkast blasting as opposed to something a little more like staid and whatever it is, or really pairing that up against wine and saying like, actually this is the feeling I want around wine. This is actually what wine is about. It should have this kind of energy. And so, yeah.
You talked about your enthusiasm having Doug Tennell and John Paul in a keg here, as it were. Tell me about what you want the wine list here to be, as opposed to wine lists you've made in the past. You talk about energy. You talk about what is it you want people to be able to experience here. You obviously have Oregon wine here.
Yeah, so a ton of Oregon wine. Keg wine is a great medium for local producers where we can work directly with them. I mean, I've filled a Rhinestones blend up from Scott Frank up on Sandy, which is 2 miles away, drove it back here, put it on tap the same day. That wine only traveled 2 miles from its point of origin. The only handling it saw was in my car, and then me bringing it into the space to a temperature-controlled space. So there's in some ways, part of it is this potential to have a wine that's very minimally handled, that's presented. And so with this list, giving people the opportunity to taste things that they might never get to taste. A single barrel from Doug Tennell for Gamay. You know, we tasted through his entire cellar of Gamay for that one barrel, and we both took notes and we came up with what we both thought was the best one together. Getting to be able to experience the relationships that I've built I guess, with people in the valley. I've also discovered that keg wine is a great medium for low sulfur wines as well, because it's such a anaerobic container. It's a stainless steel, super anaerobic. So as far as natural wines are concerned, I think it's actually a great way of expressing these natural wines as well. Except if there's reduction. If there's reduction, then keg wine amplifies reduction because it's so anaerobic. And then, part of it is just introducing, and this goes back to any wine list, making sure that there's a face behind the wine. And I think the very personal element of this list as well is that, people can like these wines. We can point them to go out and visit the valley then, and maybe even shoot an email to someone on behalf of the guest and say, hey, they had our wine here, your wine here. But again, I think we also do things like keg younger wines, or keg, like I'll send a keg out with somebody and they do one keg sans souf before they hit the rest of their tank with sulfur before bottling. And they'll drive it from the winery to here, goes from winery temperature control to that back fridge, and gets plugged in right away. And so and that's something like those kinds of opportunities I've been thinking about more and more for the last 2 to 3 years. Just saying like, oh, hell, let's have fun. Let's have some real fun, but like let's also, we get to go into cellars and taste through these things, and so like that's what this can become part of. Like let's taste something, like we do Gamay Nouveaux here from people too. It's like we get to taste wine through the sort of process. So like let's utilize these kegs. I'm not going to do 5 kegs of that, but let's do 1 keg of that and run it as a super cheap special so that people can see what it feels like to taste something that I'm on the fence about, maybe the winemaker's on the fence about, but let's throw it in a keg and give people the opportunity to drink through something like that. And obviously the 2-ounce pours are great for that. So again, it's showing wine in its different stages. I do hold back kegs too. So like the Clos Electric Blanc, I poured one off, but I have one that I'm going to hold on to for a year or two, and then pour that off later. Just checking to see how things age in keg, see what's going on. But yeah, I think trying to take some of the fussiness out of wine is always where I want to go with it.
Do you find yourself seeking out producers more often, or do you find people? Do you find yourself seeking out producers more often, or do you find people coming to you and trying to get their wine into the restaurant more often?
Both. I mean, more recently it's been people seeking me out, but definitely for the first 6 years, talking people into putting their wine in keg was a huge process. And there's still people that push against it, but I think, when you're pouring single vineyard stuff from Doug Tennell or Clos Electric Blanc, it furthers the conversation a bit, and also working with importers like Jameson selections for the Clos Cibone and keg, and having things like La Zora from Salamanca, tiny little region in Spain, tiny micro producer, and pouring a Rufete Tempranillo blend out of keg here is super fun. And so encouraging, up until now, being able to encourage other people on other markets to work with keg programs so that we can get more interesting stuff in keg, so that kegs don't just become the property of Southern glaziers and industrial wine. So saying like, hey, no, we need to make a fight for it to happen to keep micro producers on lists, and
you also, go ahead, sorry.
No.
I was going to say you also produce your own wine, or have your own wine program that you're making here. So tell us a little bit about the wine that you're making for Cooper's Hall, and obviously you talked a little bit before the camera about the bottles and how you're kind of altering the presentation also in stores as well as in here.
Yeah, sure, yeah. So one of the big things with Cooper's Hall obviously is our own program, Cooper's Hall Wine. We opened in 2014, and since then have saved over 400,000 bottles from the recycling bin. So single-use packaging is something that we're definitely really interested in, and the sort of the kind of waste that we produce for a luxury product, right? I mean, again, it is a luxury product. So there's a lot of, in my mind, ethical questions that we need to start asking ourselves as an industry. How much water are we using? Are our vineyards pretty much the cultural equivalent of golf courses, where we are dumping a ton of water onto properties for a product that's only affordable by a very small margin of our society? Cool thing with Keg Wines, with Cooper's Hall, it is a mid-price brand. So we are making quality wines that are made ethically. My partner, Phil Kramer, his vineyard property it was planted back in 1980 by the Dobbs family, all on its original rootstock. So it's in between Malala and Silverton, so in the East Valley, all hard-packed clay out there. Original rootstock, dry farmed. We are live cert, we are not organic. Always happy to have fist fights about that with people, but but also asking the real questions like, is this okay? Is live cert okay? Are we actually cutting down on carbon emissions with keg wine? And so being part of different studies. So we were part of a study that looked at carbon emission reduction in stainless steel kegs versus plastic kegs. And so people look at plastic and get very upset because it's plastic. But that's because the steel isn't being smelted in their backyard. So if the steel was being smelted in their backyard, then they might have a different opinion about how much worse plastic is than stainless steel. And so being vulnerable and being willing to be part of those studies, having our assumptions being challenged. With the bottles, we partnered with OBRC with the Bottle Drop Initiative and the Bottle Drop Refillables, and those were designed specifically for the beer industry. One reason is that beer just has a faster turnaround in production and bottling. But we wanted what our sort of like core message of cutting down on single-use packaging to extend to the shelves, and it was really cool to be part of that program. I believe the carbon emission reduction between those bottles and recycled bottles is 90%. And the other 500 ml beer bottles, they're actually all pulverized. They're all made from pulverized glass here in Oregon, so it's actually a 100% Oregon product through and through, which is pretty neat. And so right now, the glass is being cleaned in Montana, but hopefully they are going to build a facility here in Oregon soon. We'll see. I'm sure the COVID will have set that back a bit. Although more breweries are bottling more than ever now because there's no draft outlet right now. So, and same for us. We're pushing more of our production into those bottles due to COVID.
So we talked about COVID a couple times. Let's talk about its overall impact for you. Obviously, we're in June 2020. It's 3 months in, 3 months since things have started shutting down.
Yeah.
Portland is at the kind of at the tail end of trying to reopen. So as Portland is kind of slowly reopening, tell me what the impact has been for Cooper's Hall during COVID, and what your kind of short-term, long-term outlooks are now.
Right. Well, I fired my entire team the day that I was supposed to go to Hawaii. So that was the beginning of COVID. Right now we're holding steady with almost everybody laid off. Obviously, most of our bread and butter was private events, and those are really challenging right now. Particularly, we are in Multnomah County, so we're probably in the most restrictive of the counties up to date. We had a bride cancel 2 days ago. She's from Alabama, and her family lives here, but she found out what the restrictions were for Oregon and said, actually, I'm going to cancel and have my wedding in Alabama where I can do what I want. And I obviously agree with these restrictions and these precautions. It'd be nice if we had a more uniform country approach to it so that things like that wouldn't happen to our state specifically, who's taking a more cautious route. As I might have said, because we are a keg-focused winery, our entire wholesale was also restaurants as well, so that ground to a stop. Luckily, we had launched the bottles right before, but still, that it can't compete with accounts like the zoo, the convention center, all of the 100 restaurants in Portland that we service. So that volume just disappeared. Right now we're seeing a slow purchasing from the suburbs. Actually, Safeway just picked up all of our bottles, which was for statewide, which was pretty amazing. Safeway's trying to rebrand themselves as more environmentally friendly, and so that actually worked out for our brand. We had actually thought a place like New Seasons might champion it more, but I think that wasn't their focus right now. So, interesting surprises like that. We are being incredibly cautious about our reopen. We have a few micro weddings in July, like 25 people. And then in August we have some bigger ones. And we won't open until August at the very earliest. We don't feel like it's ethically responsible to bring our team back to make less money than they would on unemployment at a much higher risk. It is very tricky to think about putting my team's safety and health at risk for a luxury item, which is what dining is, or in a place like this it is for sure. And so that's, those are kind of soul-searching things that I'm thinking about. I know that we do have to get back to business, and my team will need to make an income, but I think it's going to be a pretty tricky way forward. We don't want to be part of a start and stop scenario as well. So that's a huge thing for us.
You also, I know, readjusted kind of on the fly for other reasons. Tell me about Portland specifically. The last month or so here, you kind of had a plan and then you altered it again. So tell us kind of about that and about the decision to change again on the fly.
Well, I mean, it all had to do with PPP funding and a lack of unified government response or coherency with how the terms of forgiveness worked for that small business loan. And so we did try to reopen, brought everybody back, And the terms of forgiveness changed, went from being an 8-week term to December 31st. So we were pretty much losing money every day anyway, even with the payroll protection. And so we again stopped it again and laid everybody off again. And I know I'm not the only small business that happened to. I know that there's people who got their PPP funding in May and had it all spent before mid-June and are closing because they had to spend the money when there wasn't any viable business to be had. And so we're fortunate to have been able to hold on to half of our payroll protection, and hopefully that'll help.
So what does the future for restaurants look like? Not just here, but in general. What is going to happen to restaurants as things start to reopen?
I mean, I probably with the majority of people who say it's going to be pretty awful until there's a vaccine or some sort of greater way to reassure the public. I think luckily in Portland we don't have to deal with people screaming at our servers because they're wearing masks, but I know that's happening elsewhere. I am worried, through the COVID experience with people wearing masks, having this even greater disparity between guest and server experience, where the server is masked and faceless, and the guest gets to be autonomous and do whatever the hell they want. I'm hoping it doesn't, but I fear already, just from what I've heard from other regions, that it's reinforcing this idea of subservience, that you can scream at somebody and treat them like they're not a human being. We already deal with that all the time in the restaurant industry. I had to deal, I remember at St. Jack one time somebody called and they were complaining about one of my servers, and I said, "You just want me to fire this person, don't you? They offended you somehow, and you're trying to call to get them fired." And I was like, "Well, I actually happened to be there that night, and I know how you treated my guest, my server, and I'm not going to fire my server." And which prompted me to have a staff meeting and say, anytime anything goes south at a table, you come get me. You won't be in trouble if you come get me. You might be in trouble if you don't, because then I don't know what's happening. So I, as we reopen, I do worry about advocating for my team. I feel like, again, we're very fortunate. We have a huge space here, but hearing things that are happening outside of our market really worries me. I see a lot of people advocating for more equality and stuff within the restaurant industry, and I'm just so scared that all of that's going to get knocked back. Like we have so many invisible people in the back of the house that need to have more visibility and be better taken care of. And with a 40% minimum reduction in restaurants in Portland, I'm worried. I think Cooper's Hall can make it, and I'm hopeful that we will push through. It's going to suck, but I'm worried at large for a lot of the progress that was being made in the industry, a lot of health that was being gained in the industry, and I just see some of that being set back.
So, thinking of the Oregon wine industry kind of at large, what are the biggest changes you've seen in Oregon wine since you've become part of the industry, and where is it now? Where do you think it's going? What is kind of the trajectory Oregon wine is on?
Well, it's definitely a little bit more adventurous now, right? I mean, it's not completely dominated by the Willamette Valley. So I'd say people are more interested in Rogue and Applegate than they used to be, and they're more interested in the Columbia Gorge than they used to be. And I think those are really great things because it creates more varietal diversity and hopefully, particularly as things are getting priced out in the Willamette Valley, there's still entry points for people still trying to get into the industry. I remember moving to Portland in 2000 and everybody was a front of the house server so that they could be in a band. And nowadays it feels like everybody's waiting tables so they can be a winemaker. So I think there's a lot of people that are, making wine as a side hustle a lot more. I mean, obviously, like you had John Groschow, you had Matt Burson with Love and Squalor, who were kind of getting into wine via the restaurant industry. Marcus Goodfellow, but now it's like a given, It's like, I had this side project with Evan Martin, the Sadness and Gamay and Sadness and Chardonnay, and I was talking to Michael Garafola, who also has Cutter now, and I was like, in Portland, if you say that you're a somm and you have a wine project, everybody just rolls their eyes at you. Like, of course you do. And, the further you get away from Portland, like the more exciting it is for people. And I said, I had a buddy who went to Oxford, and he said, if you're in Oxford or anywhere surrounding Oxford and you go to Oxford, no one could give a shit. It only matters the further you get away from Oxford. And so I think, that sort of somm winemaker thing is pretty played out. And like, I love my project with Evan, and I think it's so special. And but I can't help but feel a little bit self-conscious about it, just because I know how all of my peers feel about somm winemaker collaborations. But even beyond that, I'm still going to keep going with it. I think that diversity is hopefully something that we're moving towards a bit more, in all aspects. I hope that we start engaging more thoughtfully about migrant worker rights. And, I've been working with Virginia Garcia Memorial Trust this last year and led a panel discussion last summer about this. But it's really awesome that we do fundraisers every year, but that's not enough. Like, real systemic change needs to happen. It is ridiculous that some of the most expensive fruit in our region is being picked by people who cannot afford health care. And that should make us all really angry enough to do something. And so, I hope, and again, I fear that COVID is going to push this back, because when people struggle, people don't enact change as quickly. But I hope that we start moving towards real change as far as how our industry works, as far as who's doing a lot of the heavy lifting is actually rewarded and taken care of. But I think conversations are being had about that. Obviously, water use is a huge thing. It's great to see more people pressuring growers into dry farming. Again, I do believe we're a luxury item, and we really have to weigh the sort of ethical responsibility of making something that only a few people can afford. Even, Cooper's Hall wine that sits on the shelf for $10 for a 500 ml, that translates to $15 for a 500 for 750. That's prohibitive for a lot of people still, and something I think of as a low-mid price point, because I have a stupid somm view of pricing. And so I hope that we start taking a hard look at that. And I think we are. I think talking to people, Jessica Pierce with Pierce Wines did her last bottling in the 500 ml, so she joined it. But then she was talking to Erica and Landon and Ken Paolo, and they started talking to people and trying to push for a universal reusable bottle in the wine industry. People giving up ego in order to better the environment is a huge thing. So again, I know it wouldn't be for every wine, but we all know as buyers that everybody wants all of their current vintage to be purchased and drank in the same year, as far as restaurants are concerned, unless we have some sort of crazy deep cellar, but none of us has that. And so, there's this sort of like myth that, and this goes to the keg wine too. Like, people ask me all the time, how does it age well? It's like, why do you care? You don't drink aged wine. No one ages wine. Like, give me a break. So we know that we're consuming all, and we want it all to be consumed within a year so we can sell our next vintage, right? Because we don't have a ton of capital. So we need to become aware of that, and again, with the pushing for a bigger reusable bottle that can become more brand organ. I would love, and I think it's happening a bit, but I would love the Willamette Valley and Oregon overall to be known just like the Loire Valley in France, for sustainable practices, and kind of this, even if it's untrue completely, like, oh, I bought something from the Loire Valley, it must be natural, it must be biodynamic, it must be organic. But that'd be great. That'd be great. That'd be great for us as far as consumers outside of Oregon. And it's great pride to have for us inside of Oregon as well. So that's what I'm pushing for. So hopefully, and I know other people are too.
So the last question I have for you is something you've already kind of answered, but I want to ask it just so you can maybe give an answer on the actual question. What is wine's role in society? What role does wine play in society?
Oh, sure. Well, it makes people happy, right? I think it is a gesture towards overlife. So, it's an expression that Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet, uses about poetry, that, when two words rhyme in a poem, you've already moved towards overlife. You've done something that is unnecessary, but it's pretty, it's beautiful. So I think that wine has within its nature that element of overlife, and obviously it is something that brings a table together, but it's something that eases people's minds and lets them talk more freely. Obviously it can be a hallmark of aristocracy and personal ego, and we see that all the time. And but what I advocate for, and even for the most expensive wines, is for joy and for overlife. When my wife was pregnant with our children, I would buy a bottle of champagne for each month. And we were committed to drinking those bottles at any given time, not a special occasion, just maybe when we were like elbow deep in baby poop and just frustrated, and neither of us were feeling great or sexy or anything. And you open that bottle of champagne and you feel glamorous, you feel great. And I love that about wine. I love that you can be sipping on a glass of wine and the world can be falling apart, but for that one moment you have like sort of glamorous aspect to your life, and it frames it in a romantic setting. And so it has the potential, towards building a romantic vision of life, I'd say, for those of us working within it. But it needs to be, again, we do need to question these sort of aristocracy of wine and the pretension around wine. And we do need to break down the ways that people can put themselves above other people by what they know about wine or don't know about wine. At the end of the day, who cares? It's wine. It's great. It's wonderful, but like, it doesn't give you any reason to have an ego.
That's all the questions I have for you. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't cover?
No, I think I've been talking quite a lot. So.
That's sort of the goal here, so I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time, for your thoughts, for hosting us here in this awesome space.
Yeah.
Hoping you get back up and rolling pretty soon. And
Absolutely.
thank you so much.